Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining me today. As you may have guessed, this video is about watercolor. We're going to look at some of the tips and some of the tricks of using watercolor, some of the supplies that you might have at home or that you might want to purchase. I hope you enjoy it. I've got my paints ready and my brushes, so get your things ready and let's go ahead and get started. Let's take a look at the different types of brushes you can use. Here's a variety. I'm going to pull this one out first. This is one that came with the praying set, and it's school grade. And if you will notice, you don't really have a good tip. You've got just kind of a flat, bulbous type of brush. You may be able to use this for washes. But I'm going to show you some brushes. If you're going to go purchase some brushes that you might want to purchase so that you can get better results. Once again, if this is what you have on hand, go ahead and use this. What you're looking for though in a brush is something that will form a fine tip. This is a Princeton. It's a Princeton round. It's a number 6. It's got a fine tip, and then when you press it down, it will fan out, but then as you pull it back up, you get the tip again. So you want something that has that spring quality. This is a synthetic sable. Some people use just the regular sable, and that's fine. This is a synthetic, and I don't think this is quite as expensive, but these are great. I've got the round one. I have another larger one too, but then I've got the flat ones. And all of these hold their shape and their form really well, and they have a good spring back. Another one that you can use is a bamboo brush, and it's used primarily for inks. And it's a little coarser. The hair is a little coarser on it, the fibers, and it will hold lots of ink. You can use it with watercolor. It's I think a little more fragile, so I'd be probably careful with this one. But if you've got this one on hand, I'll show you kind of when you wet it. See how it comes to a nice point? So you can make marks, thinner marks, and then spread it out to get different effects. Let's talk about the types of paint you can use with watercolors. If you have just a praying set, this is the kind of watercolors that we used at school, in elementary school. They're fine, but if that's all you have, then yes, go ahead and use them. What I find is that the pigment is not as strong, and they seem to dry a little duller. They just handle a little differently, but these are fine if that's what you have right now. You can buy pen sets, and those are like little squares, and you can buy, if you run out of one color, you can pull it out and replace it with another and keep your set together. You can get tube watercolors in just a variety of colors. This is a Winsor Newton brand, and what I've done with my tube watercolors is I went ahead and put them in this set, Rigger Art. It's a real handy set. It's also got a thumb grip that if you're out painting or you just want to hold this, it's an easy grip, and it's got places to put your brushes in here. But what you do is just squeeze out a little bit of paint in there and just let it set up and dry for a while. And then you can come back in and you have all these mixing trays, and you can reconstitute the dried watercolor and keep using this. I've had these colors in here for, oh gosh, a long time. I don't paint with watercolors every day, but I have used them over the past year or two, and these are still good and ready to use. And then we've got something called gouache, and I'm going to show you some samples of what these different kinds of paints look like on paper. Gouache is a type of watercolor, but it has more opaqueness to it. It even has a white color that you can get to actually paint on top of things. It depends on what you want. If you want flat matte color, gouache might be what you want to use. If you want more luminosity and transparency with your colors, then go for the watercolors. Let me show you some examples of what these look like on paper. And then for our demonstrations, I'm going to go ahead and just use the tube that I have, the tube paint that I have set up in my palette over here. Here I'm wetting my Prang colors. This is the cheaper version of watercolors. And I'm just loading the brush, getting it nice and full of paint. Gonna just kind of pull down. And we'll take a look at that, and let's see what happens if I use my tube watercolors. This is going to be a slightly different color of red, but I still want to get this nice and wet and my brush nice and loaded. Wet it a little bit, pull down. And then I'm going to try my red on the pan. This is Winsor Newton. Once again, different color red. I didn't have matching colors here, but this is alizarin crimson. It's going to be a darker red, but we'll still get the brush nice and full. Okay, that's with them being wet, but we're going to let them dry and let's just see what happens. If this is the Prang and this is the tube and this is a Winsor Newton pan, we're going to see just how these dry, if there's a duller color, if there's any difference. Here's the paint sample that I did a little while ago, and I let it dry. And if you can tell, here's the Prang, the cheaper one, here's the tube, and here's the pan. I think both of these are Winsor Newton. So it's not either one. It's your choice. Whatever you have, go ahead and use. You're going to find with the tubes and the pans that you can find more colors. Prang just comes in your basic colors. You don't have a lot of choices. You might find some differences with blending with Prang. To me, the Prang looks a little duller, but that's just me. And like I said before, if you've got the Prang and that's what you want to use, go right ahead. Okay, earlier I had mentioned gouache, and I also wanted to bring up acrylic, since that is a water-based paint also. Gouache is on your left, and as you can tell, I said this earlier, that it is more of a flat, opaque type of watercolor, whereas the acrylic on the right side, it's basically a plastic component type paint that when acrylic paint dries, it has kind of a plastic skin on it. So when you water it down too much, you're really breaking down the components of that paint. I don't think it's good for watercolors. You can water it down some or use some kind of thinner with it, but there are problems with doing that. So I've shown that to you, how it kind of breaks up on the top part, and then the bottom part was just a stroke of plain acrylic. Here I've listed some of the paper types that I'm going to be talking about. Here's a question that you might have, and that is, what kind of paper should you use for watercolor? You can buy large individual sheets and tape them down. You can buy small notebooks, different types of notebooks. This one is cold press, and I always get a cold press instead of a hot press. What it says is exactly what it means, the way the paper was made. If it was pressed with a hot press, it's going to be a slicker surface. But if it was pressed with let me show you a texture here. Cold press, there's going to be some type of, I don't know if you can see, some type of texture to it. Now you can get 140 pound or 300 pound. 140 pound is fine. The main thing that you're looking for with a watercolor paper is something that's sturdy, something that's cotton and will absorb the paint. You don't want it to have a slick surface. You don't want it to ripple too much. So if you use construction paper or a thin paper, yeah, you can put watercolor on it, but it's not going to hold up to the different techniques and just adding that much water to the paper. So this is a brand that I use. I've also used Arches. This is Stonehenge. I've used Arches watercolor paper, which is really good also. But what's interesting about this is that it's put together in a block. So I don't have to tape this down. I can just paint directly on it. And then once the painting's dry, I don't know if you can see this, but right here is a little area about 1 inch long that doesn't have any glue on it. That's where I take my X-Acto blade and I peel up that sheet. It's like peeling paper off of a pad of paper. It's very neat. So I'm going to do some demos on this to show you. One exercise that we're going to do is to complete a sampler of different techniques. And if you noticed, I've taken a flat piece of paper. This paper was not on a block. It was a separate sheet. So in order for it not to end up rippling and warping as I put water on it, I went ahead and taped it down. Now you can use the blue painter's tape, or I used yellow frog tape. Both of them are really good, and the reason you don't want to use just straight masking tape is that it'll probably rip the paper. When you get finished painting and you want to peel this up, it will probably rip the paper. But this is kind of a low, these type of tapes are low tack, and so you can end up not ripping the paper when you pull it up. The first sample that we're going to do is something called wet and wet pulling. So we're going to start off, I've got my clean water. I'm going to start off with maybe a blue. Here, I'll pull this over here so you can see it. I'm just going to start with a blue and get my brush nice and loaded with paint. What I do sometimes when I'm starting out painting, I'll take a spritzer of water and I'll just spritz everything on here to kind of start activating the paint. Okay, so I've got this. Let's see. I'm going to start off with a real nice, heavy pool of color here. I want it to be nice and wet. Then I'm going to take some water, wet my brush a little bit, and I'm going to pull it down. Do you see how some of that paint I'm pulling? I'm getting a gradation in my color as I pull it down. The more water you add, you can keep pulling it down. Now what you're going to have at the end of this is a little sampler sheet, and you can label them, what you did and how you worked with these pieces and what technique you used. I'm going to do one that involves a pushing technique. So I'm going to take two colors. I'm going to start off with that same intense blue. Oh, and one thing I didn't mention was when I taped this paper, I used just the back of a sketch pad. And I just taped it on there so I'd have a way to move this around. Do you see when I'm doing that, how it's kind of pulling? I'm pushing that paint up in there. And do you see how you can, whatever color, I may have used the color didn't show very well, but when I kind of pushed that up into that part that was wet, do you see how it drew that water and that color down into the red? So I'm going to call that kind of a pushing technique. Let's try another one. Let's try another color here. Oh, let's do a different one. Let's use yellow ochre and see what happens with that. That's still wet. Okay, watch this. I'm kind of pushing that up in there, and it is dragging that color down. Okay, let's try something next that is a, I'm going to wet the entire section here and see what we can pull with, what we can do with some of the paint. Here's something I wanted to show you. We're still working on the sampler sheet, but I did want to show you, when I do my water, I usually have 2 containers of water. One is the clean one, and one is what I keep cleaning my brushes in. So if I want to come in here and say, oh, I'm just going to wet it with clean water, I'll have something to wet it with that looks fairly clean. This had a little bit of pink in it, but let's say I'm going to do that. I'm going to wet that whole section. I'm going to try to do a flat wash and see what happens. Let's do, let's use kind of a green over here, a moss green. I can just keep blending this and blending it until, if I wanted to get just a flat wash, I could keep blending it like that and it would be fairly flat. You can also, let's do a wet, we're going to do something, let's say this is all wet, and you know this could be a wet color that you keep wet. Oh, maybe I'll just do that. Well, maybe I'll do that on the top up there. No, this is a sampler. We're going to do it this way. So I'm going to put some blue in here, and it's touching. I'm just barely touching. Look at that. It blossoms. This is a neat technique on some flowers. If you want to make some flowers, there's certain ways that you can do this. Okay, so let's try another, what color? I'm going to use I think a red this time, or an orangey red. And I'm going to try something with spritzing it with water and then spritzing it with alcohol. So let's pull this over. I'm going to put some red on here. Kind of an orange red, vermilion red. Do you notice that when I start adding water to this, how you start getting value changes? It starts lightening up the watercolor, and that's just a value change. So now I'm going to do something with, let's see what happens with alcohol. This is just a little container that I put rubbing alcohol in, and it will have an effect. Look at that. It creates a texture. That's a bit wet, so I might want to come in and keep doing that. But the alcohol dries faster, and if you want to create some kind of texture, that's something that you can do with that. That's a way that you can do that. Let's try something called dry brush. I'm just going to use a flat brush for this, and I'm not going to wet the brush first. I'm going to get some pigment, and I'm going to stroke it across. The paper's dry, the brush is dry, hence it's called dry brush. Let's try something where I take my paper towel and do a little dabbing on here. I think what I'm going to do is lightly wet this. Oh, my brush is a little dirty. That will still work though. I'm dampening that, wetting it. I'm going to come in with, I might try a different color blue. I'm pulling it all the way down. Let's say I want a horizon line there. But now I can come in and maybe I want to just dab some. There's going to be some clouds maybe up here. So this is just kind of showing you, it hasn't all absorbed into the paper yet, and this is showing you some of the textures you can create. That can create kind of a cloud look to it. And then one other thing I want to show you is if your paper has dried, you can come in and add something right up to that edge and it's not going to bleed. Now this may be a little damp to do this, but we'll see. That's not too bad. So let's say that's my ground down there. If that had been still super wet and then I'd put this right next to it, they would have bled together. That can be something that you may decide that you want. So what if I made that into something I want? Kind of, just a little bit bleeds together. Maybe for that distance, that's what I'm going to strive for. Let's try doing some overlays with colors. Starting with, I'm going to use my big flat brush. Blue, kind of a phthalo blue. Now I'm going to let that dry, come back, and after it's dry, put another color over it so that you can see how it kind of has almost like a transparent glaze, how it can cover the others. If you're in a hurry with watercolors, one that you can do is take a small hairdryer and just accelerate the drying time by drying your paper that way. Okay, this is dried, and I'm going to show you how we can put another color over it. This is a little bit of color theory too, because if you have a blue and if I am going to put a yellow over it, it's going to turn into kind of a green color. Let's see what happens here. That turns the watercolor kind of green. Now, if I were to come back in and say I'm going to take an orange and put on top of it, the orange and blue are complementary colors. So let's just see what happens. I won't tell you. Gets a little muddier, but it turns, that was kind of a reddish orange with the blue that almost turned kind of purple. When you add complementary colors with each other, sometimes it will create mud. In this case, it created kind of a, I don't know, kind of a grayish blue purple. This turned into kind of a green. So these are just some ideas of how you can layer your watercolors. So here's my final sampler sheet. I pulled up the tape and I labeled each one. And then the next image is of the wet techniques I was showing, the pushing and pulling. And I wanted to show this up close to you because I felt like on the sampler sheet it was the color was a little dark. So this is just a lighter version of showing how the water and the color pull together. Here's an exercise I want you to try. This is a value exercise, and with color, value is just how dark and light something is. And what I did was to draw, you don't have to do this perfectly, but I just drew some grid marks on here. What I'm going to do is put the pure color on these center marks, like this is a kind of a red-orange. Coming down, I'm going to pretend like I'm adding white to it, and I'm adding white to it by letting more of the paper show. So I'm going to keep adding, let's try this just a little bit. The next one down is going to be lighter. It's a little too light. Going to keep going down, and each time making my value lighter. And it should be a gradual thing. So kind of work with this and see how gradual you can make this as it goes down. And if you feel like you got too much color on it, you can always come in and dab it off with your brush, soak some of it up. But I'm going to work my way on down till where it's just barely pale. Then from this color on up, I'm going to do two things. I want you to practice and see what happens if you add its complement. And then if you add black, so let's say I took that orange red and, I'm going to add, let's see, is this a blue that I want? You know, what happens when I add that blue to it? What color am I going to get? Basically, I'm going to be going dark. I'm going to keep going dark, and I'll lighten that some. You can just kind of play with this and just see what you get. That's a beautiful Payne's gray color. Then I'm going to try adding, what happens if I add just a little bit of black to that orange? Do I get a different, color? These are some tips besides, you know, practicing value. And I have a problem with watercolor where I just get real heavy-handed with the color. But this is just a good chart to have. And then what I'm going to end up doing is right here along the side, I may draw in those lines after it's dry, and I'll write out here, what did I do? This is my pure color, and then I was just adding water to make a lighter value, and then up here I was adding its complement, and then adding black, and I can do shades of that all the way up. So practice this with different colors. Try to use, like my next one might be a different red, like alizarin crimson, and I'm going to add green. That would be the complement. So I'm going to add green going up. I'll give you a picture of this when I have finished, so you can kind of see how it turned out. Here's my finished chart, and as you can see, I had my pure color. I labeled it that. Then, as I went on up here, the first two rows are adding the complement of that color. And you can look at a color wheel to figure that out. Then I went on and I started adding black to it. Down here is where I just added water to make tints. These are shades. And if you notice, you come up with just some beautiful, interesting colors from yellow mixed with some black up here. There's a beautiful army green that you get. This is a great chart for how to mix colors. If you're looking for what to use for shadows, or you don't want to just come in and add black. So this is a great tool. I encourage you to go ahead and explore all the colors of paint that you have by doing this with a complement and then adding water. Here are some brush strokes I want to show you. Let's start off. I did a few leaf patterns, and I want to show you how to hold the brush to create some of these. And I'm using a leaf as an example, but this is the way you hold the brush and how you use it in any type of painting. This is going to help you. This is just kind of an exercise. So let's do this on the larger pad, and you can hold the brush this way and you can hold it this way, and then you can do a combination of the two. Now if you are to hold it, get my paint going here. Okay, if you are to hold this, I'm going to pull it over here so you can see that what I'm mixing. If you are to hold it sideways, you're going to get a stroke like that. I didn't have enough paint on that, did I? You want to really get your brush loaded. You're going to have a stroke like that. Nothing wrong with that. It's just a choice. That's what happens when you use the whole side of the brush. But then, if I come in and want to use the tip of the brush, I'm going to hold it up and down like this. And look at the fine lines I can get with the tip. So let's practice some leaves where you use a combination of those holding techniques. I'm going to start off just with, I'm going this way with my leaf, so that's kind of how my brush is going. I'm going to start off holding it this way, and I'm going to not push down very hard, then I'm going to push and pull up. Then I'm going to come in here, push, and pull up. And that's how you can make a leaf. I'm going to say as an exercise, practice mixing different color greens. That makes it kind of fun. I go this way. Maybe I'm going to did you see the stroke? Just practice. I want you to practice the way I'm holding it. This way for the thin line, this way for a thicker line. Let me try it one more time. I can't get enough water on my brush for some reason. Okay, so let's try that, and then I will come back and show you that same holding of the brush, that same stroke, and how to make some flower petals. Here are some illustrations and tips on painting flowers. When I was doing this sheet and I was showing examples of leaves, I also started painting some flower blossoms, and these are just made up. I think that maybe we'll call that one a black-eyed Susan, but I kind of just made up different types of flowers. One thing that I want to show you is if you've got a white flower, a light color flower, and you think, well, remember the white of the paper is your white paint. So you can't really paint the flower white because you're using transparent color. So what you can do is paint around it with a darker color. Make sure there's contrast next to those edges. That'll help a flower, or really anything you're painting, to pop out if you're trying to make a lighter color or a white pop out. The same down here, I just started putting some, this can be a poppy or, like I said, any kind of flower. But I'm putting a dark blue, a darker hue around this. And by doing so, I'm painting the negative space around it, not just the flower. When you do that, and I'm going to show you this next page, and I want to confess here, this is not watercolor painting. I do watercolor painting, but I wouldn't say that I'm a prolific watercolor artist. I know how to do it. I probably paint more in oil, so I have to always struggle with that transparent aspect. I'm kind of learning right along with you as we're doing this. But I was trying to kind of sketch in some white flowers, maybe once again a black-eyed Susan, and once again putting some, let me put a little darker color behind here. I'm putting some darker color behind here. And I don't have a great composition built or anything. But can you tell the difference of how, if I put that and continued with my composition to where there were dark aspects around it, how that white flower is going to pop. Then some of the shadows on the white flower might be real faint, real pale, faint blues. On the same page, I'm going to show you some flower blossom, maybe some petals. You're still using this, this is the size, what size was this? This is a 12. I really like this brush because the tip gets real tiny and then you can press into the body of the brush. But if I wanted to make some kind of petal, I could start, like if this is the center of my flower, I could start here. It's almost like the leaf. I'm kind of like pushing, starting small and pushing. And if you're doing a flower, you're making sure you're starting from the center. So if I did a petal like this and then filled it in. And maybe even while it's still wet, I can add some darker things down at the bottom and have it kind of spread out. So you need to plan when something's wet, when you can do the blossoms that we tried on our sampler sheet, and when something is dry. For instance, this was all dry and I could paint in around it without it bleeding into the flower. So those are just some things to consider when working on a flower or a bouquet like this. How to paint a landscape. I showed you a few examples of some simple landscapes. So we're going to try a little exercise here where we use some of the same techniques on your sampler sheets, and we use that in this landscape. And as you can tell, I used the wet. I did that pull where I pulled the darker color, I pulled it down, dabbed it with some paper towels to create maybe cloud formations. Then while it was still wet, I did the technique, the push technique, where I did a different kind of color, pushed it up into that paint, and you can see where it did some bleeding. And that's kind of what you want for your distance in your landscapes, because you don't see things in the distance quite as clearly, and it's called aerial perspective. Then I just kind of made up land formations, different land colors. Down here, you could also, we'll try that dry brush. After everything's dry, we'll try the dry brush technique to see if we can make it look like grasses. So let's move on to this one. First thing I'm going to do is get all of my paints ready to go. Now, before I even start on this, I'm not going to draw on this. You could take a pencil, and a lot of people do this. You draw the placement of where you want everything. So maybe I will. Let's say that's my horizon line. I've got some land formations. I know I want some some mountains or hills right there. That gives me some guidelines. If you use a regular pencil, you're not going to be able to erase that. I mean, if it's in a white space, you can, but chances are you just want to draw really light to where you can't see them. Another option is to use a water-soluble pencil. Sketch and Wash will allow those lines to kind of disappear or dissipate when you add water to it. But this is just a regular pencil, and as you can tell, I just lightly sketched it on there. Okay, so I'm going to take my brush and trying to figure out what color I want to use here. I think when you're using your watercolor paints, it's fun to mix colors. I'm going to come in and I'm going to just see how loaded my brush is. And just like what we did on that example, I'm pulling that down. And when you are doing, sometimes with landscapes, do you see how this is kind of bleeding? Sometimes I'll take it and I'll turn it down like that and let it get some qualities of bleeding. And I can dab some of that up if I want to. I almost don't need to dab it you almost have a cloud formation in there. Maybe I'll dab a little bit over here. Okay. And then, if this is still wet, which I'm hoping it is still wet, I'm going to come in with maybe a purplish kind of color, because mountains, I may want that to be purplish. And I'm going to just barely touch that. And you start seeing that it starts kind of bleeding up into the paint that's above it. Okay, so kind of get that horizon line going. And I'm going to work on some colors for the land. And then I'll be right back. I'm going to take, instead of using this brush, I'm going to set that one aside and then take this dry brush. I could take this one or this one, but I'm going to use a flat brush. You can purchase brushes that are called fan brushes. I don't happen to have one right now, but it's where the bristles are just kind of out in a fan like that, and it helps you to make marks, the dry brush marks. But on our sampler, remember how let's see if this color works. I took just a little bit of paint on there without wetting the brush. A little bit. Need to get some more color on there. There you go. I just wanted to show you, this is just a technique. Maybe I want this to look like grasses in the foreground. Not going to wet the brush. I'm just going to use this kind of technique to show grasses. Okay, so let's take off the tape. This is always the fun part. Well, painting is too, but this is fun to take off the tape, and you can see the edges are going to be nice and clean. And there you have it. There's just a simple, I'm challenging you to create a simple landscape like this using the wet in the sky, pulling the pigment down, then kind of pushing the wet into wet to make some blurriness in the background, dabbing maybe for clouds, some striations for land, and maybe a dry brush technique at the base for grasses. Here's a landscape. It's a different approach, but I did want to show you this. This is more of an abstract landscape, and if I were truly, when I paint, this is kind of like how I like to do it. It's all with watercolor, but what I did was take a water-soluble, this is an art graph, but you can find any kind of water-soluble mark-making tools, and I just started thinking, oh, I'm going to activate the surface with lines, and then I came in with the colors that I saw in that landscape in my mind, and I just started dabbing them in, leaving some white spaces, letting things kind of bleed together. So here is an abstraction of a landscape, and you know, we can do this kind, have fun with this, or this is really fun. I love doing abstractions too. This is our last exercise. I'm going to talk to you about circles and orbs and stones and rocks. I just splashed paint on my paper. There we go. I love hiking, and I love looking at different types of rocks and their colors and the formations. And this is just a fun exercise where we're going to practice using the brush by creating a stacking of circles and orbs, and we'll just say that they're kind of like a rock formation that we might see if we're out hiking. And it's going to get you to practice how to hold the brush, how to fill it in, and then not to splash on your paper, that sort of thing. So let's start at the very top. I'm going to say, I'm going to fill all this in. I'm going to come in with another color. I don't think there are any blue rocks, but we're going to pretend. This is going to be making a circle. And look how when I touch that, it bleeds in there. I'm going to make these all different sizes. Let's do something that is just a little larger. I'm going to fill them in, but you might decide you don't want to fill your entire piece in. But I want you to notice how these colors are merging with each other. And I just think that's kind of a fun, well, let's just pretend that we were hiking and we ran into a little tiny orange rock. And then I'm going to work on this, and I'll show you just a little bit. I'm going to come right back. But what I'm doing is just kind of building this fun stacking of orbs and blocks. Orbs and circles and rocks. So let me work on this some more, and I'll be right back. For some reason, this is a little bit of a relaxing exercise for me, and I just want you to fill your page with these shapes and let them touch, let them bleed into each other, and just see what you come up with. You can make up, one neat thing about this that I like doing too is mixing different colors. I might decide I'm not going to just use colors straight from the tube or straight from the pan. I'm going to mix up some things. You know, I mixed an orange with alizarin crimson. I I added some black. I mixed some green with yellow ochre. So it almost becomes like a color chart too, that you can see how things bleed together, and it's kind of interesting to see what different colors you can mix from your watercolors. Okay, I'm hooked. I'm hooked on the way these orbs and rocks all stack together. I love the way the colors bleed into each other. I love the color mixing. As an exercise, just play with this. Mix all kinds of colors and see what you come up with, because I think you'll probably have lots of fun doing this, just like I did. I hope you've enjoyed this video on beginning watercolors. We've covered quite a bit, including brushes you can use, types of papers to use, and different types of watercolor paints that are available. We've done a sampler sheet exploring some techniques with watercolors, as well as value study, as well as exploring brushstrokes used to create floral images and landscapes. There are so many ways to develop a watercolor painting, so I hope you keep practicing and enjoy the process.